Hi there, this is Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we're doing chapter 4 of book 1, chapter 4. Yesterday we started again um, the account, and we noticed that the account was he's going to go into the household, he's going to focus on the household, and he looked at three relationships, and he's going to and that of master slave, husband wife, parent child. And then he's going to say that and then the idea is that most people talk about it's about getting kids. Instead of this, we're going to focus on get some knowledge about how does the city, what is necessary for necessary goods. But then he says we're going to focus on a relationship, but we're going to start with two questions, and that was the question about starting with slavery, right? Because the question of the master and slave. It all because there was two questions. He says there's two opinions. One is that there's no difference between a master, slave, a household ruler, a king, and a political man. Uh, and then the other one is that there's no such thing as a slave. There's no such thing by slave by nature. It's all by convention. So therefore, we're going to have a discussion of slave. We're going to look at slavery and what does slavery means, and therefore we're going to start the question of slavery, right? And that we go from the assertion that there is no natural slave now to the question about whether there is what is slavery and the natural slave and who is the natural slave, right? Now, chapter 4. Let's go to this. Um, Now, property is part of the household, and the art of acquiring it, a part of a part of the house is a part of household management. Now, property is part of the household, right? Property, your own things, property, land, and things like that. And the art of acquiring it, property, is a part of household management. It is not is an is missing here. For without the necessary things, it is impossible to live, either to live or to live well. Semicolon. So he makes an assertion to without the necessary things. Remember, we talked about the previous chapter. We're going to be what relates to necessary things, because without the necessary things, you can't live, uh, or to live well. Okay. So therefore, and that this idea of property deals with the necessary things. Okay, and therefore he begins. The property is part of property is an essential part of the household, the oikos. In this sense, and therefore that's the question. So let's continue. And just as the specialized arts must of necessity have their proper instruments if their function is to be performed, so too must the household manager. So what are the tools? What are the instruments of? In other words, every artist has instruments. Any specialized form of art, the artisan, the techne is artisan, the art crafts, the maker of things. If this is, in other words, as any artisan has tools to do his art, if therefore is if household management is an art, they would have to have tools. So what are the tools? So too must the household manager must have proper instruments. Okay. Now of instruments, some are inanimate and others animate. Two types of instruments, he says: an animate instrument and an inanimate instrument. The pilot's rudder, for example, is an inanimate instrument. In other words, a pilot is the ship guy, right? The person at the ship piloting the ship. The rudder is a inanimate object. That's an instrument of the ship of the pilot at ship, right? For example, in other words, but his lookout, an animate one. So a man looking out just like this. Now today we have radar, so it's an inanimate radar device is no longer animate. But back then it was animate. Therefore, there's two types of fifth instrument. There are inanimate instruments and animate instruments. Okay, people who act as instruments. This is a stilos. This is a servant. This is a worker in that sense. Servant, worker. They're an animate instrument. For the subordinate is a kind of instrument, whatever the art. So if you're a subordinate and you're a subordinate to the assistant to the artist, you're subordinate to the artist, you're an instrument. So therefore, the same thing company. This is everything. It's any kind of labor. The laborer is an instrument to the people, the artist doing this. The artist himself is an instrument doing the making. He's making it. He himself making. He uses mechanical instruments. He also uses people to help system. So therefore, this is the idea that this is the concept of an animate instrument. A possession too then is an instrument for the purposes of life. And one's property is the aggregate of such instruments. And the slave is a possession of the animate sort. Now, this is a 21 note. This is one of those interesting ones. The Greek word for the acquisitive artikete, possessions, klitema, and property, klitisis, are all created. In other words, the acquisitive art, the art of getting, tikrete, that's what he said earlier, the art of getting, right? Possessions, klitema, and property. These words are very closely related to each other. And Aristotle's like this is very interesting. This idea that words and meanings are kind of things that are different meanings. Therefore, the art of getting things, property, and let's go back to that note. Uh, 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 let's go back to that note. That's 20. The 21 is here, like again, possessions and property. Property, possessions, acquisitive possession, things that possess, and property. Okay, so we go back here. Um, every subordinate, moreover, is an instrument that yields many instruments. For if each of the instruments were to perform its function on command or by anticipation, as they assert of Dadaeus, or the tripods of Hespasius, which the poet says of their own accord came to the gods' gathering, so that shuttles would weave themselves and picks play the lyre. Master craftsmen would no longer have a need of subordinates or masters for slaves. Stop here. This is a very important thing he's saying here. So let's go look at 22 for a second, because this is a very important point. This is from Homer's Iliad. Dadaeus was legendary sculptor who was held to have the power of creating animate statues. So this idea of animate statues, robots, right? They are the robots, and or what the tripods of Hespasius were these again. These are these things that moved around and did like robots. In other words, if shuttles could weave themselves and picks can play the lyre without that, a master craftsman would not need workers. I mean, come on, this is what's happening in the world, isn't it? You don't if McDonald's can have automated machines that cook the food and sell the food to you, why do they need workers, subordinates? And then you wouldn't need slaves. In other words, the reason for slavery ultimately in the classic world was that some labor was so toil that money people would not do it even for money. And you needed to have, and because some things needed to be done, you needed someone to do it. And if they weren't people willing to do it, and if these things were necessary still, you had to force them to do it at some level of coercion. The things that would not be done voluntarily or for exchange, and that maybe there's some things that they would do for prices, but the price you couldn't afford that price. In other words, it wouldn't be the ability. In other words, this idea slavery emerges out of this conception that there is um, um, and it has the conception of that. The idea is that some things need to be done. Somebody has to do the work. Servants. This is why delos is the word slavery in Greek is complex. It's unfree. It means unfree at one level, but it also means this distinction between servants, you know, and slave, a possession. And if you ever looked at and also peasants and serfs in Europe, peasants, these were really not free people in that fundamental sense. They were, but then in the Christian world, we freed the idea they're free. They're not our property or controlled by the master anymore. But still, there's the perception of they're not free people, and they're not why they don't have total possession of. They're not owners. They don't have they are dependent on others for their sustenance. Okay, they can't provide their own sustenance. A owner of a property, of a farm or something, the owner can work the land to achieve his own sustenance. A physical labor only has his body. Okay, and therefore, like a slave, they get they, the owner feeds them because they need to feed them. They're feeding him. Why? Because the owner needs workers. The slave is a coerced worker, right? That's what it is, a real coerced worker. And this is why Marxists crap about this. Uh, Once you have workers, late capitalism, slavery is no longer needed, necessary. Why? Because the mechanism of the market can provide means so that slavery is no longer necessary. In fact, slavery in capitalist markets, industrial capitalism, are almost antithetical to each other in that sense. So, and this is even more radical. The idea here is that once you have technology, once you create technology, once you create industrial machines that can do labor, that makes labor and the division of labor, that moves it to a certain way that required, in other words, even what used to be done, in other words, we have machines that, once you have machines that make toilsome labor no longer, you don't need human bodies anymore to do it. You have either animals or machines that can do it. Then what? Then you don't need them anymore. You don't. If you have machines and things that can do you don't need slaves anymore. So technology and industrialization, which implies technology, will eventually make slavery irrelevant. That's what this passage is really about. This metaphor of talking about the statues of Daldius, or the tripods of Aspastius, and that things weaving themselves. This one sentence. Aristotle understood technology. That technology would make slavery unnecessary. But for him, but there's something going on here. He's silent. He doesn't cheer. In other words, he will admit that slavery is unjust later, or conventional slavery is unjust, and much of slavery is. But he doesn't then champion its removal. Is this? We have almost here a silent warning about technology. There is a silent. He's not going to say, well, let's try to conquer nature and to find a means to. No, he doesn't argue for the conquest of nature, and he doesn't argue for technology. He's silent about. He mentions that he indicates he understands it's a possibility, but is silent about it. And he understands that once it exists and its possibility happens and its reality happens, then slavery becomes, laborers and slavery become unnecessary. But then that's the problem, isn't it? That you get rid of both slavery and dumb labor. Let's think of what the worries about the self-driving car does to the employability of, not, in other words, lower IQ people. In other words, in other words, people who are not, in other words, what technological society where robots and everything else do everything, What this ultimately does, it makes significant proportion of humanity who can't be innovative, who don't have the mental capacity to be creators or to be producers, makers of things. They don't. They're not. In other words, they don't own capital. They don't. They don't own. They don't own something that's fungible to cash. Right? Capital is something either property or labor. In other words, labor is fungible, is capable only if the labor can be transferred into something exchangeable. Fungibility means exchangeability. So if a machine can do the same labor I do and is cheaper than me, then why would I ever hire you to do it? So therefore, it becomes dead capital. Labor becomes dead capital, and that the other idea is our ability to create ideas and create things that are able to be turned into money. This is mental capital, right? This is the third, land, material goods, labor, and then intellect. This is the third level. This is the one that Marx totally misses capital. And this is the other thing he doesn't. Marx does. He kind of sees that technology. He thinks the division of labor, and I think that is true. That the division of labor is the start of technology. The division of labor. That's why he so much hates the division of labor. Uh, Aristotle is quiet here. He understands it. He understands it, and therefore he's not going to embrace technology. It's not an option. He knows it's possible. He doesn't think maybe we should do it, and a he will defend the provision that there are natural rules. In other words, he denies the argument that there's no natural slave and no natural ruler. He thinks there are, but it's not knowable. It's not easily knowable. This will be an argument that I'm going to argue, and that what is a natural slave is simply it's not something that actually would be useful. In other words, if slavery is something useful, if the slave is something that produces something for the master, right? The problem is the natural slave is useless. The natural slave is only really a natural slave because he doesn't have he lacks the mind, he lacks the intellect, and that therefore he needs a master so that he could just live. This is not a, a productive element. Mastery is not natural slavery. Natural mastery isn't done out of a benefit. It's done. Natural slavery is actually done for the benefit of the slave. But the nature of despotic rule and despotic is done for the master, right? The reason why slavery is done conventionally is that the master gets the benefit from it. The slave works and the master eats, right? That's the from the of that situation. So therefore, let's turn this. We have no need for that. Now, the instrument mentioned are productive instruments, but for a possession, but a possession is an instrument of action. So productive and therefore making something that makes those instruments that they were making instruments. But a possession is an instrument for action. This is poesis. This is the word here in Greek. Productive instrument. This is poesis. Instruments for poesis, making, producing. And possession is an instrument of praxis, acting. For the shuttle comes from the shuttle comes nothing apart from the use of it. While from the clothing or a bed, the use alone. So therefore, from the shuttle, what comes from it? Whereas the thing made from it, I can use it. In other words, the shuttle itself, the shuttle that is the thing that makes things, it's only good for making the thing. But the thing, I can wear it, it's clothing, it's useful, it does things, it can do many things to act, in other words. Further, since production and action differ in kind. In other words, poesis and praxis differ in kind, and both require instruments. These must necessarily reflect the same difference. In other words, this idea here is that, in other words, that he's saying this that if regarding poesis, the thing that makes versus the thing made have two different things. The thing making is only valuable for the thing that is made, but the thing made has a use of its own. Okay? The difference between the thing making and the thing made. Well, regarding action, that's about poesis, right? Making. Now, the same relation must also be true about action, things of action, the things of action, the instruments of action, between that which the tool that makes and the thing that is made. Okay, so he's saying that if it's true, if this relationship, what he says about the shuttle, is true regarding make things made about action, the things of action. It's in other words, he's doing a parallel analogy. That if, in other words, if these things are parallel, that poesis and praxis are, if the relationship between the thing made and the thing making, or the thing making and the thing made, in the realm of praxis should be the same. The relationship, the kind of relationship, should approximately be true as, for that as well, right? Life is action, not production. So life is not production. Life is action, doing. Action is being doing. It's doing. It's praxis. Life, we live in praxis in this fundamental sense. Again, this gives us a kind of this leads us to. I mean, I'm going to stop here for a second. Book 6 of the Ethics, Aristotle's Ethics. He distinguishes between praxis. It's, in other words, praxis action is a product and of doing, and there's two types of praxis. There is praxis that makes, which is poesis, and the virtue of that is techne, art, craftsmanship, the doing it right, making correctly. So action has two levels. There's the action that is making. That's poet. That word is poesis. But then there's the action that is pure action, doing, and that is he uses the same word, praxis. Praxis is the general thing of this doing, acting, doing, and then there's an acting that the mere acting, not an acting that makes, an acting of me doing, acting itself, and that's praxis, and the virtue of that is phronesis. The excellence of that is phronesis. Now, praxis for Aristotle is something that is about things that are true or false, true and false, what is valid and what's not valid, what's true and false. It's not eternal. Whereas he compares praxis with contemplation or theoria, theorizing, right? Theoria, contemplation, ideas, which at the level of ideas or theorizing, these things are either true or not true. Whereas things are, it is simply are. In other words, it is either so or not so. Okay, there's a very easy word. The realm of praxis is complicated because the realm of praxis, this is in book 6 of the Ethics, he discusses this. This is where he deals with the intellectual virtues, right? He in the first 2 chapters, he deals with the problem of what defines it, the question of what the scope of intellectual virtues are. And remember the 5 intellectual virtues. They are techne, art, craftsmanship, which is tied to poesis, phronesis, which is prudence. This is tied again to it's the action that is tied to praxis. Then the things of theoria, the contemplation. There is the It is the truly. It's the virtue of knowing the arche, the first principles, the starting points, the arche of things. This is nous, he calls it. The virtue of knowing the whole of things. This is Sophia, wisdom. And then the knowing about deduction, the virtue of being able to follow from arche to deduction, logic in that sense, logisticon in that sense, is part of this, is episteme. Okay, we use the word knowing, but this is the word for science. Science, this is the word that's translated as science, episteme. We get the word epistemology, which is knowing, science of knowing, right? So I brought this here because I think this is important to understand what he's saying here. Action is not production. The slave is therefore subordinate in matters concerning action. In other words, the slave is the servant or the thing like that is a subordinate in terms of action, not of making. In fact, this is interesting. He seems to want to suggest that it's something, when you think of the slave as a theme of production, then that's when it becomes unjust. Not the worker, but the idea of the slave. Because why? Why is it unjust? Because it's a production for the, but for action, that you're doing some action, something that the action is going to be odious, tedious, undesirable, and you have to something that people would not choose to do, right? In that sense. Now, a possession is spoken of in, so let's continue next paragraph. A possession is spoken of in the same way as a part. So possession is like a part. It's how we, in other words, possession of something is spoken. We speak of it. This is he's saying how we address it, and it's spoken in the same way as a part. A part is not only part of something else, but belongs wholly to something else. Similarly, with a possession. In other words, let's stop here. In other words, a part is really tied. The part has no meaning outside of the whole. This is what he's going to say. A part, it's not that the parts have a meaning outside of that. No, really, the part's whole meaning is what it is a part of. He's going to say this is the slave, possession. A possession has tied, in other words, but wholly, similarly with a possession. Accordingly, while the master is only master of the slave and does not belong to him, in other words, and while the master is only master of the slave and does not belong to him, the slave is not only slave to the master, but belongs wholly to him. So the relationship is completely different. In other words, he's saying that a master, there's a relationship between the master and the slave and the master. In that what is it that the master is only master of the slave. He does there's no possession by the slave. The slave does not possess the master in the same way the master possesses the slave. And the slave is not only slave to the master, but wholly belongs to him. So therefore, that's the idea. It's both. The slave is both slave, a servant, and he's also a possession. And that's what difference. In other words, that's the difference between a master and a servant in that sense. A servant is, but again, the Greek is the same word. This is why it's confusing a little bit. The delos can be servants, can be free in our understanding of war, but in the ancient world, in a lot of, and even early words, servants were not seen as free. Like serfs weren't seen as free. In other words, so only in a modern society is there a rise of people who are not possessed, owned, or controlled by but work for them. They're free people. They're free. They're not possessed. This is something that Aristotle does not speak of because he doesn't. This is not the way of doing things at the time. 6. What the nature of the slave is and what his capacity then is clear from these things. For one who does not belong to himself by nature, but is another's, although a human being, is by nature a slave. So in other words, I have no possession of myself. I cannot possess myself. He seems to be saying, I have to be, in other words, I'm possessed by another person. For one who does not belong to himself, I'm not able to possess myself. That's what I'm saying. In other words, if I'm able to possess myself, then I'm not a natural slave. But if I'm not able to possess myself, and I need someone, in other words, I am in need of someone taking control of me, then I'm a natural slave. This is in that fundamental sense. Does not belong to himself by nature. In other words, I'm able by nature, the nature of my capacity, my ability, I'm able to master myself. I'm able to master myself, control, make my decisions, make my choices, live my life in a sense of being able to make a decision, make a choice. If I don't have the capacity to do that, and I need another to do that for me, then I'm a natural slave. That is the capacity, what natural slave means here in a sense. A human being is another who. A human being is another's who, though a human being is a possession. A human being who is another's who. In other words, I belong to someone else. Although a human being is a possession. And a possession is an instrument of action and separate from its owner. In other words, it's an instrument. In other words, it's an instrument of action. It's not something I really can. It is separate from me. It's not a part of me. Okay, it is an instrument of action that is and is separate from the owner in this sense. And that ends this chapter 4, which is where we get that natural slavery and the complex concept of what is a natural slave. Aristotle does say that there are natural slaves. He's not going to deny this, and he will say nature does distinguish between those who have foresight and those who don't have foresight. He's not going to deny this, but the problem here is who's who. It's not obvious, and he'll continue this in the next chapter. So let's stop here and do that. If you have any questions or comment, please put them below, and if I see them, I will respond to them. And I'll do it. If you like it, and share. If you don't like it, say don't like it, and give you criticisms. You free subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. Get a friend to subscribe. Share this with someone that you can. Please do this. This would be good. Help build the channel a little bit. If you have, you can follow me on. I said subscribe to get turn on, but get others to subscribe. But you can follow. You can forward on social media and this. But you can follow me on social media. That's below. The links are below. If you want to help me contribute, you can contribute by becoming a member of Patreon and become a Patreon or subscribe star. I don't care which. I mean, I understand why people won't do it. Or if you want to help me, you can do it by buying my book, a notebook for Aristotle's politics. This is a workbook. This is like cliff notes on Aristotle's politics. This is not to be read in substitute of reading the politics. You should be reading the politics. Again, the Lord edition that we're using here. But this is a good guide. It gives you kind of this is my version with some extra notes in it. You can put notes in it. You can put comments. I get after every book, I have a notes section that you can even add notes that you think of things. I have charts of the various things. It's a very good, useful guide if you're going to be studying the politics. And it has a fantastic. I'm using a friend of mine, Starton Lockwood's. I asked him for permission to do it. He said okay. What do you call it? His extended bibliography, section by section of politics for the secondary literature on this. I only used the English language one. I didn't put all the foreign language stuff in it, so because this is an English language author. So therefore, graduate students might think this is a little limited. I don't include everything in it. And otherwise, if it did, it'd be 500 pages. It's already 280. Okay, so have a great day, and see you tomorrow when we look at chapter 5. Okay, take care. Bye bye.